It is one day before 1 month, before 1 year after October 7th. The Chicagoland Jewish community will be holding an anniversary event on October 7th. You'll see information about it in our weekly email in coming weeks. You have to register in advance, but you're certainly welcome to go. And we will be thinking about that as we go through our high holidays, which bracket the actual anniversary, with Rosh Hashanah on the 2nd, 3rd, and Yom Kippur on the 11th, 12th. And so we could spend all of those holidays thinking about it again and again. But it doesn't take much for us to go back to that time and to think about that day. Here in North America, by the time we woke up on October 7th, it was already a disaster. It was the morning of Simchat Torah. It happened to be a Shabbat in 2023. And on that day, we experienced the worst 24-hour period for the Jewish people since the end of the Holocaust. Under a barrage of some 4,000 rockets, 6,000 Gazans, mostly fighters for Hamas and Islamic Jihad, broke through the border fence around Gaza into Israel proper. They attacked IDF early warning stations and bases, and they also assaulted some 20 communities and kibbutzim, even cities, with murder and rape and revenge on their minds. When the dust had settled and the Israeli army and police had finally taken control, far too late in some places, and the operational mistakes have begun to be reported today and recently. When it was finally settled and we saw the final tally, some 1,200 Israelis had been killed. If you do the math and proportion it to the American population, it would be like 40,000 people had been killed. By comparison, 9/11 killed about 3,000 Americans. That 1,200 Israelis and those in Israel who were killed included 379 Israeli soldiers and police, 725 Israeli civilians, and also 71 non-Israeli citizens, foreign workers mostly, who were working in the kibbutzim and in the cities. Several of those killed were over 80 years old. The youngest person killed was 10 months old. 70 of the Israelis who were killed, of that 1,200, were Arab Israelis, not Jewish, mostly Negev Bedouin. There were also 3,400 people who were wounded, and there were 247 soldiers and civilians who were taken hostage. Some of those hostages were released in a ceasefire deal just a few weeks later, but most of them have either been found dead, a few rescued alive, and the bulk of them, over 100, both living and dead, are still in Gaza. Now, I don't need to replay for you in detail the horrific deaths in Kibbutz Be'eri or at the Nova Music Festival in Re'im, to talk about the video that has since emerged of bodies and fire and terrified hostages and exultant militants, testimony of rape and murder. Some hundreds of the attackers were killed or captured, but most escaped back to Gaza. Now, what followed October 7th? What has been October 8th and forward? It's been the Israeli response into Gaza. It's been the Hezbollah response from Lebanon in the north to the Israeli response, and the Iranian response to the Israeli response, and the Houthi response in Yemen to the Israeli response, and eventually, and increasingly recently, what's been happening in the West Bank in response to the Israeli response. That corner of the world has been on fire since October 7th, and it will be after today as well. There's been a lot of creative culture that's come out of this experience. You may have seen the pictures of tables set with empty places in public squares. You may have seen the protest marches. You may have heard testimony of people to what happened that day and how they've been feeling since. And a lot of people have written poetry and songs to try to articulate how they felt. One of the most repeated and spread and discussed in Israel is a poem by Elchanan Nir that appeared in Haaretz, the sort of national New York Times kind of newspaper for Israel, in December of 2023, near the end of the calendar year. It's called Now We Need a New Torah. Now, like air to breathe, we need a new Torah. Now, in this stifled breath and the hacked neck, we need a new Mishnah, a new Gemara, a new Kabbalah, new mystical ascents. And in all the brokenness and salt and ruin, now a new Hasidism and a new Zionism, a new Rav Kook and a new Brenner, a new Leah Goldberg, a new Yahweh Da'at, and new art and new poetry and new literature and new cinema and new ancient words and new ancient souls from the treasure of souls and new love out of the terrible weeping. For we have all been flooded by the rivers of Re'im and Be'eri, and we have in us no mountain, and there are no more tablets, and we have no Moses, and we have no strength, and given into our hands is now everything. You can hear echoes of the destruction, but also a greater despair. If everything old is useless now, the old Zionism is useless, the old Hasidism is useless, the old art and poetry we use to articulate a secular Israeli Jewish culture, it's useless. We need new souls. We need new ancient words. The ancient words are not serving us anymore. And we don't have the faith for a new Sinai and new tablets. We certainly don't trust our Moses. We have no Moses. And we seem to be at the end of our rope. Now, I follow Israeli news every day. I follow, of course, what's on American media and social media. I have a subscription to the Israeli paper Haaretz I mentioned. I also listen to a sort of center-right news podcast from the Times of Israel to get a variety of perspectives. And some of their correspondents drive me nuts with their opinions, but that's good. It's good to hear people that you don't agree with. But it's not just news in the Middle East, of course. October 8th and forward has affected what's happened in cities and college campuses, with pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel advocacy on the rise. We've seen an increase in incidents of anti-Semitism. And not just what I would call debatable anti-Semitism, where someone criticizes Israel and someone else is very sensitive and assumes it's anti-Semitic. I'm talking about unambiguous, clear, violent, disturbing anti-Semitism, even more so in Europe and Canada, but here in America as well. We've seen it affect American politics in a number of ways and a number of levels, from local to national. As I mentioned earlier, I've already talked about the anti-Semitism crisis, the campus crisis earlier, and for those watching the video, I'll put links to those talks as well if they are curious to hear more. And I'll have more to say at the High Holidays next month. It's been a challenge to find the right balance of our Jewish focus these last several months. I could talk about this every week, but then we wouldn't be exploring Jewish history or Jewish culture and philosophy and current events and personal growth and all the other aspects of being a well-rounded person. It's not only the crisis. We have to find that balance. And so tonight, I do want to focus on October 7th and the aftermath, what happened, what's happening now, and what might be next. And I would argue that this has raised an existential crisis for many Israelis, but also for many Jews around the world. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And so the war in Gaza, or is it the war on Gaza? Depends on your political perspective. It began with Israeli bombardment and then ground forces moving in after several weeks. There was Hamas rocket fire back. Sometimes the rockets would be fired at the last minute before the army was about to arrive, so they didn't aim particularly well. They haven't caused particularly great casualties, but they've continued, even in the last couple of weeks. One or two here or there, just enough to keep Israel reminded that they're there. There have been thousands of Israelis displaced, both in the north from Hezbollah rockets and in the south from Hamas. Some in the south have returned at this point, with Hamas on the run, so to speak, in Gaza, without the rockets left to launch. But some have refused to return because they just don't feel safe there anymore. And in the north, many have not been allowed to return. We've seen this internal exile not be unique to the Jews, of course, because in Gaza, there has been massive civilian displacement. When Israel went into the north, the people in the north moved to the center and the south. When they went into the center, they moved to the south. When they went into the south, they had to move back to the north. They're in tents, they're in ruins, they're in dire straits. They've talked about it in terms of an internal exile or even a new Nakba. Nakba is the Palestinian term for what we call the creation of Israel, what they call their dispossession and the creation of the Palestinian refugee crisis, which continues to this day as they still don't feel at home, even if they've been there for 70 years. And so they feel like they're lost again, they're wandering again, they're suffering yet again. When we think about basic human needs, other than clothing, they have none of them. No food, no shelter, medical care, personal safety. It's in the air. Over 40,000 Palestinian casualties have been reported. Now, we know that the Hamas-run health ministry does not differentiate between militants and civilians. So we don't know how many of that 40,000 were militants. Israel tends to assume that anybody who's male between 18 and 45 is a militant, which we know is also not necessarily true. And Israel claims that about a third of the casualties have been militants. But that still means tens of thousands of casualties who were not. Now, the key question here is, for the displacement, for the destruction, for the deaths, whose fault is it? Is it Hamas, who hides behind the civilians, who refuses to release the hostages, who invaded Israel on October 7th and took the hostages in the first place? Or is it Israel who sends the bombs and the soldiers? Or does each bear some degree of blame? The population of Gaza pre-war was 2.1 million people, give or take. If you had 40,000 people who died out of 2.1 million people, that's 2% of the population. Again, to translate for American terms, if we had 2% of our population die, that would be 6 million people. Now, whether this mass death is genocide or only mass death, it's a debate over intent and scope, but it's also somewhat distasteful. Like, does the label really matter with that many people dead? Now, currently, we're dealing with the question of a ceasefire. Could we finally get a ceasefire? For weeks and months, some people have been calling for a ceasefire. For others, it's been weeks and days. But now the vast majority of the Israeli public, or I shouldn't say vast majority, a substantial majority, 60%, 65, maybe 70%, are in favor of some kind of a ceasefire deal to save the remaining hostages if it can be done. But the ceasefire doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen. I think in February, Biden said, oh, it'll happen in a few weeks. And in May, he said, Israel's agreed to this proposal. And then Blinken just today said, oh, I'm hopeful. Maybe it'll happen. And it doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen. Now, again, who's to blame? Hamas certainly owns the bulk of the blame because they have decided there is no limit to the suffering of their own people that they are willing to allow to happen. They have apocalyptic aims. When they invaded Israel on October 7th, they imagined that Hezbollah would invade from the north and the West Bank would rise up and it would just happen and Israel would disappear and they would come back to their homeland. No more Israel. Goodbye. That's been part of Hamas's goal since Hamas was founded. And it didn't happen. And so the more apocalyptic, the more disastrous it gets, the more they hope for something, or the more they reach for a solution that simply causes more death and more death. So Hamas will not give in. They don't care how many of their civilians die. They see them as martyrs for the cause. The blood of their Palestinian freedom is watered by the martyrs, right? The trees of freedom are watered by the blood of the martyrs. And so they're to blame for no ceasefire. But Israel and specifically Netanyahu also share some blame by moving the goalposts from the proposal in May, by adding in things like maintaining a permanent Israeli presence in the Philadelphia corridor between Egypt and Gaza, which was never mentioned before. He decided to mention it. By arguing over which prisoners are going to be released in the exchange for the hostages. Part of the challenge is that Israel had set itself a few war aims that were either unattainable or in mutual contradiction. Their initial war aims were, we want to get our hostages back, we want to destroy Hamas and make sure it's never again a threat. Now, destroying Hamas requires mind reading. Because how do you tell if a Palestinian supports Hamas without telepathy? Well, that's one problem. But the second problem, and we've seen it dramatized in the last few weeks, is if you're trying to destroy Hamas and save the hostages, it may be that by trying to destroy Hamas, you are threatening the hostages. You yourself may kill the hostages with bombs, with soldiers. There were those 3 hostages that escaped early in the war and were shot down by Israeli soldiers who thought they were militants. And then we saw this week, when the Israeli army was getting closer and closer to these 6 hostages, they fulfilled what Hamas had told them to do. The guards were told, if the army gets close, kill the hostages and run away. And so they did. And so if you have someone with a gun to the head of a hostage, and they say, don't get closer. If you get closer, I'm going to kill the hostage. And you walk closer, and you walk closer, and you walk closer, and they kill the hostage. Obviously, the hostage taker is the murderer. But you could have stopped. Maybe there was some other way you could have approached the question. So in their goal to undermine Hamas, weaken it, they've tried to find as many tunnels as possible and destroy them, including smuggling tunnels into Egypt. But this raises this new question of this Philadelphia corridor. Will they simply rebuild it? After all, Egypt was supposed to stop smuggling before. Can they be trusted to stop it now, seeing what happened? Or is it back to the same old, same old? And right now in Israel, there is a bitter argument going on over what to do with the hostages, how to save the few that may be left alive. What's the best way to get them back for the smallest possible prisoner exchange? Now, you may recall about 13 years ago, there was an Israeli soldier taken alive as a hostage into Gaza. His name was Gilad Shalit. And ultimately, after a few years of captivity, he was released by Hamas in exchange for 1,000 security prisoners, including a man who wasn't very well known at the time named Yahya Sinwar, who is now the head of Hamas and the militant behind the October 7th invasion. And so it's not an irrational statement to say, I don't want that kind of release again. We did 1,000 for one, and we do that now. That's all these militants who want to destroy Israel back on the streets. Many of them have life sentences for attempting or for killing multiple people. Attempting to kill or for killing multiple people. So what's going to cause Hamas to give up the hostages? Is it causing suffering to the Palestinian population? Well, we now know that's not going to change their mind. But early in the war, the thought was, let's put a blockade in. No water, no food. When the Palestinians suffered, Hamas will let go of the hostages. It didn't happen. Because again, Hamas doesn't see suffering of the Palestinians as a barrier. So then Israel thought, let's invade. Let's put military pressure on Hamas. If Hamas wants to survive, they'll give up the hostages. And maybe that worked in November after the initial invasion. But the more that Israel said, we're going to destroy Hamas, destroy Hamas, destroy Hamas, what incentive does Hamas have to make a deal if Israel says, our goal is to destroy you all? It was sort of like the decision of the Allies in World War II to demand unconditional surrender. If you demand unconditional surrender for the fanatics, it's a fight to the death. That's why in Sun Tzu's Art of War, he says, always leave an escape route for the army. Don't surround them on four sides. Give them some way out. If there were the possibility of exile for Hamas, or a power sharing arrangement with Qataris and the PA, the Palestinian Authority. But there is no exit. Israel said there is no exit for you, Hamas, and so Hamas has no incentive to make a deal. So civilian suffering for Palestinians didn't work. Military pressure hasn't worked. Maybe a negotiation for a ceasefire and a prisoner exchange is possible, but that would mean allowing Hamas to stay in power. And too many politicians and too many platforms have said no Hamas anymore. In fact, the right wing of Netanyahu's coalition is opposed to any hostage deal with Hamas because they don't want any deals with Hamas, period. And Netanyahu is worried about his coalition falling and what would happen if he were not prime minister in his corruption cases, in his legacy, and even a majority of his own supporters think he shouldn't run for prime minister again in the next election. Well, this is the long-term challenge. Hamas is not a threat at the moment. It has been seriously degraded. It has lost 99% of its rockets. Its fighters have been killed and scattered. The tunnels have been destroyed in the midst of Gaza and in the Philadelphia corridor, all throughout Gaza. Even the reputation with the Palestinians is at a record low because the Palestinians, even if they're mad at Israel for dropping the bombs, they know who made this happen. They know who poked the bear. And so they don't particularly love Hamas at the moment either. That argument over that corridor with Egypt is also an internal Israeli argument because the army chiefs have said, let's save the hostages. We can monitor it remotely. We've got drones. We've got sensors. We'll manage. And Netanyahu says, because Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the right wing of his coalition, say, no withdrawal, no deal. We must have this corridor. Netanyahu won't give in. And he goes in public and he goes into press conferences and he has his maps with his pointer and he's trying to make his PR version of the problem solve his dilemma. Ultimately, of course, there's the long term. And I asked this question in November. What's after? If you don't know what's after, how can you get towards the after? Is there going to be a foreign consortium of people in charge of Gaza for a while? Some kind of native Gazan government that springs up by magic? Will you extend the Palestinian Authority's authority into Gaza itself? If you pull out and do nothing, all that's left is Hamas. And even if they're a gang of thugs, they'll still take power. Every time I've spoken on this topic over the last 11 months, we've talked about the challenge of cutting out the Hamas cancer without killing too much of the body of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Maybe Hamas going into exile, or some of the prisoners not going to Gaza but going abroad. That's one solution that's been floated. Or maybe what happens in Gaza is what happened in Vietnam. As my father put it, explaining it to me, you declare victory and leave. Wherever you are at that moment, we've won. Now we're leaving. Declare victory and leave. We've killed and captured as many fighters as possible. We've destroyed the infrastructure. We've degraded their capacity. Good enough. But can anyone say it's good enough? Now, the real crisis, of course, the existential crisis for Israel and the Jewish people is what's happening on the inside, not just the war. Gaza, the Hamas is not a threat to Israel. Hezbollah is in sort of a stasis at the moment. The Houthis are far enough away. And Iran proved to be inept when it tried to launch those rockets with the combined forces of Israel and Jordan and the US and the UK. They were able to intercept that attack. And Iran still hasn't attacked for the killing of a Hamas official in Iran last month. So with that reality, the internal conflict is what's really tearing Israel apart. And I think tearing Jews apart more broadly. You have these mass protests that are over the priorities of the war, hostages or defeating Hamas, and the protesters want one thing, and Netanyahu and his government want another. And we've seen many tensions play out. We have the right wing of his coalition versus everybody else. We've seen a rise in terrorism in the West Bank, not just by Palestinians, but by Jews who are going into Palestinian villages and burning cars and beating up people, even shooting people, cutting down olive trees. And this is just accelerated and accelerated. And there's no consequences to it. They don't get arrested. They don't get investigated. And it's a Wild West with unfortunately, the Palestinians are the natives who are getting run over by the Israelis. The right wing refuses any hostage deal, despite what the street wants. They've even expressed a desire to reoccupy Gaza. Let's send in new settlers to Gaza. They were pulled out in the early 2000s, and they want to go back and claim land again. We've seen thugs, part of this West Bank militia world, attacking food aid convoys coming from Jordan to go to Gaza, dumping out rice and flour lest the Palestinians eat something. There's been police crackdowns against the protesters looking for a ceasefire because the head of the police is Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's part of this settlement movement in the West Bank. There's even been protests against military police arresting soldiers who were torturing Palestinian prisoners. So the system actually worked. There was a report of torture. The soldiers who did it were investigated and arrested. And protesters, including right-wing members of the Knesset, went to the military prison to try to break them out. That's the right wing versus everybody. But they're unrepentant and they're unbending. We've also seen moments of the ultra-Orthodox sector of the Jewish world in Israel against everybody else, most importantly with regard to draft and the military. The Israeli army is based on a reserve system. But these reserve soldiers are coming on 200 days of reserve service. You know, reserve service is like the National Guard. It's supposed to be, 1 weekend a month or 6 weeks a year, right? Not 200 days out of 365 days. They have jobs, they have lives, they have families. And so the dilemma is they need more manpower. And where could they get it? They could get it from the ultra-Orthodox world, which before the 1970s served in the Israeli army, except for a very small number of yeshiva students who would study full-time. It was up to maybe 1,000 in the 1970s. Started at 400 under David Ben-Gurion. So a very small number. And as part of coalition politics, a blanket exemption was given. And now there are thousands of able-bodied men who could serve. And the army wants to accommodate them. They'll even let them sign up in recruitment centers with no women there. Because, of course, the women in the army are not dressed modestly by ultra-Orthodox standards. But the ultra-Orthodox refuse. Even the men who are working and not in the yeshivas will not go. They're resisting draft orders, but they're in the coalition. And they won't undermine the coalition because they're never going to get a better coalition than this one for their priorities. Now, we've also seen Netanyahu versus the hostage families. And for some American Jews watching remotely, it's confusing. What do you mean Netanyahu is opposed by what are the hostage families doing, complaining about what Netanyahu's doing? But they don't trust him. They just don't trust him that he has the good of their people in mind or the good of the nation in mind. They think he has his own good in mind. And they just don't believe it's part of a national mission. And he's never taken responsibility for what happened on October 7th. Which, remember that statement that Truman had on his desk? The buck stops here. Well, the shekel stops somewhere else, evidently. And then we've also seen a rehash of the crisis before this crisis. You may remember, before October 7th, there were thousands of people marching in the streets and major protests, and people wanted Netanyahu to resign. That was over the judicial reform package. It was the left wing and the center who were appalled at the excesses of the right wing of the coalition. Well, this has come up again and again. People want a new election now. Israel had 5 elections in 4 years, between 2019 and 2022. 5 elections in 4 years. But nothing in 2 years, and probably nothing for another 2 years, because the current coalition will never do better than they are right now. Now, what's the challenge to those of us outside of Israel? Well, for many of us, Israel was always seen as a safe haven. It was a safe haven for Jews that needed to flee elsewhere. It might have been a germinator, an idea lab for the creation of new Jewish culture and sparking Jewish interest and solidarity internationally. But what if it's not safe? And what if it doesn't live up to our ideals for it? There was, for a long time in America, what I would call a soft Zionist consensus. There were always anti-Zionist figures, from the ultra-Orthodox to far left-wing Bundists and Yiddishists and socialists. But the vast majority of the American Jewish center, had a kind of soft Zionism. They weren't planning to move to Israel. But they supported the idea that having an Israel was good for the Jews. It was good for the Jews there. It was good for the Jews who needed to flee. It was good for us too. They felt it was important that Jews should support Israel in its time of need and even in good times. They felt that on balance, having an Israel was good for American Jews, and it was good for humanity. All that news about the startup nation, it was a way of saying Israel is good for humanity. They do humanitarian aid in disaster zones. They invented drip agriculture and the wonderful microcircuits that they've put together, PayPal identity verification. There's all kinds of things we use all the time. Intel has factories there. Your MacBook is made there. There's all kinds of pieces of Israel's good for the world that helped us justify to ourselves why there should be an Israel. It's not just for us. It's good for everyone. It could be the center of Jewish identity because of that creativity and vitality, and because it was, for a time, the largest Jewish community in the world, maybe tied with the US now. There's a lot of debates about that. But most importantly, we hear from groups like AIPAC that Israel represents Western values in the Middle East. You could be a Jewish state and a democratic state. Those two sets of values would not contradict. So you didn't have to pick. You could be both. Now, the problem is that soft Zionist consensus has broken down. First of all, it's not a consensus anymore. There are plenty of people who are plenty more critical than they used to be over things Israel has chosen to do, to the point in some cases they've defined themselves as resigning from Israel. They are even on the other side of the spectrum. They call themselves anti-Zionists because they think Israel's a bad idea on balance. It's a bad idea for humanity. It's not good for the Jews. They want to go a different direction. But there's also people who are truly conflicted, who see their own commitments to democracy and its values, the idea of a state for all of its citizens, and then they see the right-wingers who want a Jewish state that's not a democratic state, or that doesn't represent all of its citizens, or that doesn't care about the Arab part of its citizens, let alone caring about the Palestinians under Israeli authority who aren't even citizens. They're willing to countenance mass transfers of population, or worse. And they are in the government. Now, the diaspora Jewish experience has also had its problems. If Israel's not a haven, we might not feel so safe here either. But this undermining of that soft Zionist consensus, that sense that Israel is important and a positive contribution to us in the world, if that's challenged, if that's undermined, then what will hold? What's possible? That tension between our Jewish identity and our humanitarian values might mean that the humanitarian values win. And we in Humanistic Judaism have always striven to have a foot in both worlds, to have our broader human commitments, but also a strong and vibrant and meaningful and uplifting and positive and important Jewish connection. That's who we are. And so maybe we have some expertise in balancing the two, but the tension between the two is also pulling us apart. Well, what will come next? I'm not a prophet. I can't tell you for sure. If there is to be a ceasefire deal, it will have to be one that Netanyahu does not want. I don't know that America has the resolve to force it through, certainly with an election coming up. We may be stuck in a limbo for far too long. Israel standing in the world going down. Hamas supported by what you might call the mostly the useful naive, who think it's a liberating army when it really isn't. I don't see a positive resolution soon. But I do see something important in this new world. Sometimes we have to face hard realities to move forward. Sometimes certain things need to be demolished for new foundations to be laid. And if there's going to be a future for diaspora Jewish identity in a new relationship with Israel, then it may need some of that consensus, some of those assumptions to be undermined for a new foundation to be built. I want to go back to that poem I mentioned by Elchanan Nir, and then I'm happy to open for your comments, questions, reactions to what I've said. He said we need a new Torah. And there's a lot of grief and a lot of tears and a lot of sadness there. But if we read through it again, you might hear at the end an opportunity. Now, like new air to breathe, we need a new Torah. Now, in this stifled breath and the hacked neck, we need a new Mishnah, a new Gemara, a new Kabbalah, a new mystical ascent. And in all the brokenness and salt and ruin, now a new Hasidism and a new Zionism, a new Rav Kook and a new Brenner, a new Leah Goldberg, a new Yehevedat, and new art and new poetry and new literature and new cinema and new ancient words and new ancient souls from the treasure of souls and new love out of the terrible weeping. For we have all been flooded by the waters and the rivers of Re'im and Be'eri, and we have in us no mountain, and there are no more tablets, and we have no more Moses, and we have no strength, and into our hands everything now has been given. Into our hands everything now has been given, and we can create the new Torah, the new Zionism, the new art, the new poetry, the new soul. It's a disaster. Is it an opportunity? Time will tell. Thank you.
How can I not comment?
Of course.
So my spilkes are all in royal, as my grandmother would say. I am in despair. My family in Israel is in despair. And fearful. Fear. I've never heard fear in their voices before. I wrote one this week who was leading protests before October 7th, and he said, we're hoping that Kamala wins. I thought that was a really interesting perspective. I don't understand talking about a two-state solution. Where? Where the hell are you going to put a second state when you've allowed all these settlers to take over land that isn't theirs? I think we've been blind all these years when we talk about a Jewish state and a democratic state. You can't have both when you're denying a group of your population. What happens to all these people in Gaza when Hamas doesn't give a damn about them? When you're hiding behind children? When all the money that the Arab countries sent in to build Gaza to begin with went to build tunnels? When if you spoke up in Gaza against Hamas, you were killed. I mean, what hope do they have? And goodness knows, we have lost standing in the world. The world is turning against us. And the last thing is, I had a conversation with a young man when we went to a wedding in Guatemala. And he said, I have to be a Zionist. This is a 35-year-old. I have to be a Zionist. I have to believe that there is a place we can escape to. And I'm thinking, this is not the Israel you think it is. And yes, there is opportunity to build, and yes, there is opportunity to create. But what you're talking about from Torah and Mishnah and Gemara and all, and Betzalel and all, from one end of time to another, you're talking 3,000-4,000 years. And yes, I forget how many years Israel's been in existence, and we build a lot, but Hamas succeeded in what they wanted to do. They tore out the soul of the Israelis, and the Israelis are scared. They're scared for their security. They're scared for their lives. And it is hard to come out of that. And then there's him, who shall not be named, who wore the middle down, because the centrist down, because every government they voted into collapsed, and so they stopped voting. So he got into power. Power makes strange bedfellows. In this case, can't deny it. So I don't see a hope. I don't see, and it's hard for me to say that I have no hope.
That's very much.
Push all you want.
No. I don't think they ripped out the soul of it. I think there was a blow, and I don't think it's irredeemable. I don't think that people who are on those streets are meaningless. The fact that they're on the streets is important. The fact that they are speaking up against the consensus, that they're pushing now for a ceasefire. I mean, some of them are the peacenik ceasefire people that were out there in the dozens within a couple of months. But some of them are people who wouldn't have been arguing for a ceasefire or to save hostages until recent events. So it feels like the tide is moving in that direction. This has been a dilemma always in response to the boycott, divestment, sanctions initiative, to say that Israel is defined by what happens in the West Bank. I don't think Israel is defined by what happens in the West Bank. It's also defined by what happens in Tel Aviv, what happens in the Negev. It's a complex country. Just like you can't define America by January 6th or by the election of Barack Obama. There's no simple answer that defines what a country is. And I think that's the case for Israelis today. I don't think there's one simple answer of what is now, let alone what direction things will go. Now, I too am very pessimistic about a two-state solution. I've been saying that for years now, that it's just too entrenched, one than the other. And some version of a state of all of its citizens, maybe a Belgian binational confederation of some kind, is the only option available at this point. I'm very negative about that too, because there's so little trust in both directions. You might have even noticed on Netanyahu's maps that he had for his, PowerPoint presentation at press conferences. There was no green line around the West Bank.
Nope.
Because he wants a one-state solution too, from the river to the sea. Just a different agenda from the river to the sea.
Two completely disparate points. Something like 60 years ago, it was Meir Kahane, of all the lunatics, who pointed out that Israel's got to decide whether it's a democracy or a theocracy. You can't be both. And I think one of the problems is in all these years, they never did resolve that. And another thing, I think something that wasn't mentioned tonight is Israel can only exist in the real world with the billions of dollars of military support from the United States. It can't strike its own path if the United States decides it doesn't like what's going on.
Well, it certainly does depend in a war setting. I'm not sure it's as required in a peaceful setting, day-to-day stuff. Israel does sell a lot of weapons abroad. They have a very vibrant economy. If you look at them on the OECD Development Index, they're in the top 30, I think, the top 20 for GDP per person. So they're not a poor country anymore like they might have been 50 years ago. But the challenge is, can America or will America use its leverage to push for what it wants to happen? It has happened occasionally in American-Israeli relations, but I don't see either side necessarily having the will to do it at the moment. And that is also disappointing. Now, whether, America doesn't like China and Russia interfering with our elections. So I don't know that Israel would like America interfering with their elections with their military strategy.
They interfered with ours.
Oh, there's been some meddling in both directions, right? So this will be the challenge going forward. What a healthy relationship between those two could be.
I have a rhetorical question. When people say there must be a seat, when the Democratic presidential candidate says, I support Israel's right to defend itself, but there must be a ceasefire. What does that mean? When people say there must be a ceasefire, Do they mean that Israel resigns from the conflict and on the trust that Hamas is going to open the doors to the tunnels and let the hostages free? I think that we're driving ourselves crazy with the minutia, trying to interpret the minutia of this conflict, trusting one propagandist side and the other propagandist side. And we seize upon what we think, what we feel is the most humanistic response, which is they've got to stop fighting. Enough is enough. There must be a ceasefire. I don't think that we press ourselves as good humanists to ask the difficult question, what does that mean? What would an actual ceasefire be? Because, as everybody has stated, Hamas broke the ceasefire that was in existence on October 7th. My other comment is, love him or hate him, Netanyahu said one thing that I agree with when he addressed Congress, which is, this is not just a war of Hamas against Israel. This is a war against the West. And we are just as much an enemy as Israel is. And I don't think that people are keeping that in mind.
I think one of the other challenges, though, is that it's not a war of all of Islam or all of the Arab world against the West, because one of the reasons Hamas acted under Iranian sponsorship in the way that it did, when it did, was because there were conversations going on about possible normalization of relations between Israel and some of the Gulf states, perhaps even as preliminary to the normalization with Saudi Arabia, an anti-Iranian alliance. You notice that all of the people attacking Israel right now are the pro-Iranian militias, proxy armies, and so on. So it's as much a battle between Iran and the West as it is between Iran and Israel and Iran's proxies in Israel. And as for the ceasefire and the defense issue, I think the challenge is that I don't know of any politician who would not support Israel defending itself against Hezbollah. That's basically a consensus perspective, or 99% for elected politicians. The question is what to do in Gaza, and those are different arguments. And I think that the challenge has to be, what are your returns for the costs that are happening in Gaza? Continued fighting will cause continued civilian casualties, continued Israeli military casualties, continued decline in Israel's standing in the world. And what's the benefit that they get out of it? A few more tunnels destroyed, a few more men between 18 and 45 that they call militants killed. Some are militants, some may not be. When is it not worth it anymore? You know, when is it time for Vietnamization? When is it time for pulling out of South Lebanon because you're just not getting any benefit being there in the casualties anymore? And I think part of the advocacy for ceasefire is not I'm just doing it for the good of humanity, or I'm just doing it for my social standing so I can go to the cocktail parties. I really think people doing that cost-benefit analysis and saying, I just don't see it worth it anymore to keep fighting, but you need to make a deal. Israel just pulling out its soldiers and then saying, pretty please give us back the hostages. That's obviously not going to do anything. So that's where coming to a deal, bending in one area, maybe the Philadelphia corridor, who gets the veto, which prisoners are released, those are really the two big issues left. The corridor and the identity of the Hamas prisoners released in exchange. But the more time goes on, there's going to be fewer and fewer living hostages to redeem, and Gaza will simply do more and more homes.
The difference is that when we left Vietnam, we went how many thousands of miles away? We weren't there anymore. It's not that easy just to say we're going to Vietnamization, whatever the word is, this situation, because they're right there.
The idea is declare victory and time for the next stage. But the alternative is eternal war. And
that's what's happening.
You have to, at some point, you have to make your choice. So, on that,